Hello and welcome to my channel Against All Odds. It's the beginning of February. Julia was back at the Schmidt clinic. Before she was discharged again to Bad Camberg, a temporary port was implanted above her heart. This port was necessary for possible infusions. Julia needed them because the old access points were clogged or inflamed. Then Julia returned to Bad Camberg. The next day I visited Julia with my parents. I rested my head there, on Julia's stomach, her chest area. And then something incredible happened. Julia put her left arm around me. That was the first active sign of life from my darling. We were so happy. It was an absolutely incredible moment. Yes, there were even a few tears. Indescribable, beautiful. In the following days, at first the nurses still helped me mobilize Julia. That means we moved Julia from the bed into the wheelchair. Did you secure her in the wheelchair? And then I took Julia for walks around the ward. We couldn't go outside yet. It was too cold and Julia still had her tracheal cannula. That means she was breathing air directly into her lungs. When we breathe in, the air is slightly warmed as it passes through our throat. That wasn't the case for Julia. Yes, I was walking with Julia around the ward. There was a corner there, so I sat down with Julia, read her the latest news on my laptop, showed her pictures of us, and of course always told her what was going on in our area. Yes, and actually one day I went ahead and recorded a video, and I did that in her room. I'll just go ahead and show it here for you now. Yeah, the video is pretty intense, isn't it? Yeah. Julia, hold your head straight. I was with my sweetheart every day. Of course, I always came up with something new for her. One day, I brought the beaver with me. Or rather, the beaver was often in my sweetheart's room anyway. I brought the beaver, had my laptop with me, and across from Julia's bed, I hung bed sheets on the wall. Then I moved Julia over into her bed. She couldn't fall out because there was a railing. And I bundled up all the tubes and lines and buried them in the pillow and under the blanket. I got into bed with Julia, turned on the projector, and let it roll. And then, together with Julia, in her bed at rehab, we watched TV. Yeah, that was also therapy for her. It was just a bit of normality. It was normality for me too. I was next to my sweetheart. We watched TV together. Maybe I was able to switch off a little here too. Yeah, I'm sure it was also a really nice feeling for my sweetheart. Yes, of course I did that often. I would lie down next to my sweetheart and watch TV with her on the wall. Yeah. Then I came up with something else. This is still the original box. So now I think so too. Here I made these little signs. I stuck some pictures up on here, just like this. Or I made little cards, colorful, with numbers. Or letters. Then Julia showed me, I held up two cards, for example, and then I would say, point to the yellow card, or point to the white card, point to the number, or point to the letter. Yeah, like that. At first, the prompt took a little while to register. She could always point a bit with her finger, but the answer was always wrong at first. Yes, of course, sometimes she did point to the correct card. But since the odds were only 50-50, it was just a guess. But anyway, these cards became a regular part of my visits. They were always there during rehab, and I regularly worked with Julia using them. By now it was the end of February. The conditions had been met. Julia's tracheal cannula could be removed. Thank God, this tracheal cannula, there was always a lot of mucus building up in her lungs. Of course, Julia couldn't cough up this mucus herself. That's why Julia had to be suctioned regularly. I've already described it, a tube, a vacuum pump. They would insert it into Julia's tracheal cannula down into her lungs and suction out the mucus. In other words, a vacuum was also applied to the lungs. And then Julia would always tense up here like this. Yes, if you witnessed it, it was really a terrible sight. All right. The tracheal cannula was then removed in Wiesbaden, and this port here was also never used. It was removed as well. Yes, of course I was there for that too. Then Julia was wheeled out of the operating room. Julia was wearing a white top. When she was wheeled out, she was in an upright position. The little shirt was completely red here. Julia was still being fed with liquid nutrition, meaning through the peg here. 24 hours before the surgery, Julia hadn't received anything, so she was there with a completely empty stomach. She was being wheeled out and all of a sudden Julia had to throw up. Only bile was coming out of her mouth in a way that's really impossible to describe. It was a strange color, and it just kept coming and coming, and it didn't stop at all. Yeah, seeing something like that, my poor darling. Yes, it was really very hard to endure all of that, especially how my darling managed to handle all of it. It was tough, yeah. Well, she managed to handle that too, and then she came back to Bad Camberg. In Bad Camberg, of course, I kept doing things with her. I worked with her using the little cards, cuddled up with her in bed, watched TV with her using the projector, and of course went for walks with her. When the weather was nice outside, I finally got to be outside with Julia too. Yeah, and then a nurse said to me, "Why don't you bring Julia's electric toothbrush tomorrow?" Okay, I brought the electric toothbrush with me. Then the nurse put the mouthpiece on. Julia was lying there. And then the nurse took Julia's hand and brushed her teeth together with her. And at some point, she let go of her hand. Look at that. Yeah, that was... I think we can do it that way too. We're just very sensitive when we do that. To describe it, was it a vegetative state or was it a vegetative state? A similar condition. So Julia still couldn't give any answers. And if you said, "Julia, take the toothbrush, brush your teeth," Julia couldn't follow that instruction either. Then Julia was handed the toothbrush and told what she was supposed to do. Yes, and then Julia's hand was guided. It's very difficult to describe that condition. Then there was also the time when I couldn't be with Julia. I was working, I had to go to work, and every day I took photos of Julia's therapy schedule. I always checked how Julia was being involved. That was usually in the mornings. At lunchtime, she got her meal. Yes, then there was always a long stretch until I could get to her. Yes, so at first as you saw in the other video, she had a small TV in her room. Absolutely not okay. So first I drove to MediaMarkt, bought a huge TV, set it up in her room and connected it. Yes, now Julia had a big TV on the ward. Whenever it was possible, I would call the ward and ask the nurses or caregivers to please turn on the TV for Julia, and that they put on a suitable good channel. Most of the time they put on documentaries, which was good and actually stuck with me because now when I come home, documentaries are often on TV, documentaries on television. Yes, I often got feedback that I was very demanding with the nurses, that I called very frequently. Well, that's just how it was. But no one ever held it against me. Only in the evenings did I get the feedback that I was demanding. Yes. By now with the doctor, it was in the evening, or rather bedtime. I was lying in bed. Suddenly my phone rang. Reha Bad Camberg, emergency. Your wife is losing amniotic fluid. She is being taken immediately to the Horst Schmidt Clinic in Wiesbaden. I got to the Reha Bad Camberg in record time. Then I drove with Julia to the Horst Schmidt Clinic. This transport, or these transports, yes, I do think that was a lot of stress for my sweetheart. She couldn't assess the situation. What's going on now? Why am I leaving here again? What am I doing here in the ambulance? So I really do think that was very difficult for my sweetheart. All right, Julia arrived at the Horst Schmidt Clinic. Julia was examined and it turned out to be a false alarm. Thank God. It was just urine. Julia then returned to the Reha Bad Camberg, and on the way, as so often, Julia had to relieve herself again. I think that was also due to the stress and the lack of patience. Okay, 2 days later, another false alarm. Julia, I got a call. Julia is being taken to the Horst Schmidt Clinic due to an emergency because of a loss of amniotic fluid. At that time, I was at work. I said, I'll drive straight to the Horst Schmidt Clinic. So I went directly to the Horst Schmidt Clinic. It was another false alarm. Thank God. The next day, I visited Julia at the rehab center. Then I noticed that the entire bedsheet Julia was lying on was suddenly wet. Of course, I immediately informed someone. The doctor came and said, "That's amniotic fluid. Julia needs to go to the Horst Schmidt Clinic immediately." No, this time I immediately objected and said, "No, that's not amniotic fluid. It's probably urine again. Julia is staying here." Yes, then the argument with the doctor started. "You don't get to decide that. I say your wife is going to the Horst Schmidt Clinic for an examination." I said, "No, Julia is staying here. This transplant causes Julia stress. This is just urine here. It's not amniotic fluid. Julia is staying here." Yes, it was quite a heated argument that I had with the woman, or rather, with the doctor. It was as if there was gasoline in the room. There definitely would have been an ignition. Well, it went back and forth. In the end, I was able to prevail. I asked our midwife for advice. She came by that evening as well. For the examination, she then carried out some tests and, thank God, was able to confirm that it was only urine. Well, over the next few days, the doctor avoided me too. At first, I didn't understand why, so I went to the nurses on the ward and asked, "Hey, why is the doctor avoiding me?" "Yeah, Miguel, you really gave her a hard time." I said, "What do you mean?" "Apparently, you really argued with her and hit her pretty hard below the belt." Honestly, I actually can't remember the argument anymore. Of course, I do remember that I argued with the woman quite intensely, but I can't remember exactly what I said. That I attacked the woman below the belt. Yeah, that fits my character. I can't rule it out. The likelihood is very high. That's just how I am. When I get into it with someone, I want to land a hit too. That's just like me. All right, so I went to that doctor and apologized to her in every way. Yes, we talked it over and settled the matter. The issue was off the table and everything was fine again, and we had nothing left to hold against each other anymore. Yes, and then during that time, Julia was also receiving therapy from the therapist. And how often did a therapy session get cancelled? Well, if a therapist is sick, you can't say anything about it if a session is cancelled. But how often did I get the feedback that Julia was too tired, or that Julia couldn't do it? Or that Julia couldn't do it? Then I said, "Look, Julia is pregnant, yes, but you don't need to treat her like a princess. And Julia is not a raw egg. I want her to receive therapy." Yes, on the one hand, I understand the fear that the therapist had. Yes, if I do that, the Julia therapy, and Julia is carrying my child, yes, of course you have to be careful, but in a healthy pregnancy, the body can handle some strain. Yes, Julia had this accident, but in my opinion, that didn't mean she couldn't handle some strain. And then it's actually positive that the child, meaning the unborn child, experiences some strain as well. Even in the womb, it already takes part in life, hears things, and notices what's going on. Okay, that was a bit borderline. Sometimes it worked, sometimes I thought it was too soft, but okay, that's how it went. Yes, we'll end here for now. Next month will be much better. That's when I'll tell you about the, until then, the most beautiful day of my life.